Now you are here for Zach. A little background information about him. Zach was born and raised in Metro Detroit. He went to Michigan State University and earned a degree in hospitality management. But then he left East Lansing and went to Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
Why would a Spartan go to Wolverine territory? The culinary answer is Zingerman's. So Zach went to that world-renowned purveyor of very fine foods, Zingerman, and it's there that he discovered and acquired a taste and appreciation for artisan cheeses. So that love of cheese and fine food developed and took Zach to Napa Valley, California.
Not a bad place to be. Yeah.
Where he went to the Culinary Institute of America. After that, he worked in fine dining and then landed at the cheese counter of the Buy Right Market in San Francisco.
Yep.
While he was there, he competed in a cheesemonger competition and earned second place. Then he decided to come back to Michigan in 2016, and he has been busy. He started his own business, Berg's Provision, serving as cheesemonger and operating pop-ups throughout Metro Detroit, especially at Gale's Chocolate in Royal Oak. Then last year, he took on a business partner, his lifelong friend, William Werner, in the back, and they became business partners and decided to expand their offerings beyond cheese. So in addition to cheese, they have fine chocolate and charcuterie. They now have a retail shop in Ferndale called Provisions. They have an online website where you can see all of their offerings. You can place an online order, or you can make an inquiry for a special order or for catering.
Please do. Please do. Yeah, visit the website.
So Zach and Will aim to offer unparalleled cheese and chocolate in service. And we are so pleased to have Zach here. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. I'm very excited to talk and share some cheese with you guys. And as Lynn mentioned, you know, we really try to have unique offerings at our shop, and we offer tastings of anything in the shop. So it's a fun place like Zingerman's to come and nosh a little bit, learn a little bit. We always have this goal of teaching as well as feeding. So today will be more on the teaching side, but there's still some snacks. And as I mentioned earlier, anybody who just walked in, try as best you can to hold off and eat the cheese along with me. It'll be more fun if we do it together, but I promise I won't hold off too long. I'll get you fed. So, the American Cheese Revolution. Welcome to the American Cheese Revolution. There's been a artisan revival of our dairy culture going on for the last, I'd say, about 30 years. And most of us aren't even aware that it was necessary or that it's happening. But as you can see with this, it is happening. There's a fun American cheese revolution going on, and we're benefiting from it. There's some really great products out there. So in order to understand where we're going, let's understand where we've been. Cheese is one of those products that's really tied to early civilization, and this idea of we could stop wandering and we can set up cities because we have a more staple food. We don't need to be nomadic. So similar to cereal grains and the advent of bread and beer and wine, cheese is something that gets people to stop wandering, sit, and make some products, right? And so you have some early depictions of that. Those earliest cheeses would have been really feta-like or ricotta-like, really white, mild cheeses, not a lot of aging, right? Because there's no refrigeration, so you can't really age something out. And if you do, you need to put it with a lot of salt water or olive oil like you would with feta. And as, it's a beautiful spot, yeah. We'll pause there for a little bit. We can enjoy the view of Cheddar Gorge. So as cheese progresses through history, it really tells you a lot about people, right? And so we're talking about this early time in history where we're kind of simple. It's just ricotta and feta. And as people start settling and those communities grow and you have the rise of monastic culture and stately manners, you usher in a time historically that author Paul Kinstedt, my favorite cheese historian, calls the age of cheese diversification. And so as this happens, as these stately manners and really the monks did by far the most work towards this, you start to have distinct recipes, and those distinct recipes start to tell you a lot about people, culture, geography, right? And so the example that I'll walk you through in a moment is going to be Cheddar Gorge. That's what we're staring at. How many of us knew that cheddar was not just a cheese but a geography? Anybody? One person. Two. Yeah, in England. So in Somerset County there is a physical place called Cheddar Gorge, and all the cheddar made traditionally was made within that area, within Somerset in the UK by Cheddar Gorge. Whoa. Yeah, please.
Was that part of the land called cheddar before the cheese?
Ooh, that's a great question. Does the land predate the cheese? I don't actually know. I don't want to give you any false information. My knowledge kind of ends with the cheese, but I know that, yeah, I think in a lot of these cases you see that chicken or the egg. What comes first, the culture, the community, or that cheese? And we'll talk about it as we kind of go on. There's all these great village cooperative systems, right, where everybody's making the cheese. Like Gruyere, for instance, the town of Gruyere, or Comté, the town of Comté. You have many people all living cooperatively to make a cheese. And it's a very unique idea. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of, you know, cheese being a story about who you are. So Cheddar Gorge, if I tell you I'm a traditional cheddar maker, I'm saying a lot about who I am. I'm telling you one that we've covered, right? I live in Somerset. I live within the UK. In terms of my resources, right, I'm close to salt. And I know that sounds silly nowadays, but historically, your access to salt becomes a very important thing, especially in cheese making. It's a very salt-heavy product, right? So when you're making cheddar, you hand salt the curd, and we'll get to that. I'll talk to a little bit more about what that means, instead of brining a cheese like you would with a Gruyere. And the reason is because I don't have to lug the salt up the hill. It's freely over at the coast. It's easy to get, right? London or England has plenty of coastline, plenty of access to sea salt. So this idea of how I'm making my cheese and conserving my salt, not so much of an issue. I also, you can be pretty sure that I'm raising cows, right? It's the dominant dairy animal in that area. So just by saying I'm a cheddar maker, I've told you a lot about myself, right? So the other thing I've told you about is a little bit about the production. So before we get into the production of how you make cheddar, because cheddar is also a process, there are other cheeses other than cheddar that have been cheddared, right? So when we talk about cheddar, we've all had a cup of yogurt, right? Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about cheese making, right? We're going to use a cup of yogurt as our jumping off point. When you look at a cup of yogurt, you have that weird little blob in the middle. That's a curd. And all the liquid on the outside is whey. See, milk is actually composed of a lot more than we sometimes think of in that kind of plain neutral white liquid. We don't think of a lot of stuff going on, but this is a breakdown of all of what's in milk, right? So you have predominantly water. You have everybody's enemy, a little bit of fat, lactic sugars, casein, minerals, and casein's protein, right? And then that's other whey protein, just a little bit. So really, cheese comes down to this, right? How good a cheese is going to be really important about how much structure I can build in it, right? And so these slides are courtesy of one of my favorite people in the cheese world, Zoe Burkle, who is out of Jasper Hills, we'll talk about. And she used a koosh ball to represent that casein matrix because it starts kind of like this. It's in there. It's untapped potential, let's say. And as you break down the proteins, didn't mean to do that. They re-knit together, right? You create a matrix that's going to capture all of those minerals, all of that sugar, all of these good things. And so hopefully they don't drain out with the water, right? And so that water, the reason why the whey looks cloudy is because not everything stays in that matrix. Not everything's trapped, right? For some of us who have a hard time with lactose, a lot of lactose falls out in the whey, so the older a cheese is, the less lactose, maybe the better on our belly, depending on who we are. So when you're making cheddar, what you've done is, well, when you're making all cheeses, right, you start with fluid milk. You then allow the milk to sour slightly, denature slightly, and in this process, that koosh ball unravels. All right? And then at a certain point, you give it rennet, you give it a coagulant, and you're asking it to refuse. Any of you guys bake at home?
Yeah.
It's similar. I always think that gluten structure, that net that gluten is that allows your bread to rise, is somewhat similar to this idea of casein proteins reknitting together. So you have structure. All right? And as you keep cutting that curd, you keep expelling more moisture, and that's where you start to get into that cheese diversification. How much water am I going to drain? What shape am I going to leave the curd in? What molds am I going to introduce it to, right? And so cheddar, back to that and back to being on topic, how is a cheddar different than other cheeses? When you have something a little bit drier than the yogurt cup, but you have a curd that you can hold in your hand, you put it into a mill. All right? So that's going to be kind of about the state of what the milk vat's going to look like when you're ready to start milling your curds. And so all of these are little curds. If we were in Wisconsin, you could let those dry out a little bit. They'd be nice and squeaky. It's a fun snack, or make your poutine. Oh, going too far. Yeah, it's beautiful. Cheese is in beautiful places. So we're going to mill all this curd, and you're going to get pieces that are about the size of a fingernail, really tiny little pieces of cheese, and you stack. So they put a mill at the side of this kind of long vats, and what they get is these piles, and they pile, put another put on top. And when it's this crumbly texture, that's when they salt. That's when they introduce the salt. And so we can think back to the cheddar that we eat. It's super crumbly, right? It falls apart. Cheddar, when you melt it, almost has a granular texture. It's because we've done that to the proteins. We've cut them up tiny, tiny, tiny. And so that just kind of, I always like to say, whatever you do in this state of cheese echoes all the way through the cheese, all the way to the final melt. So that's why cheddar has that texture, right? And once again, it's a response to what they have at hand. They're not so worried about salt conservation. But now, we move to the Swiss Alps.
May I ask questions?
Please do.
You talk about, and I know what you're talking about, the cheddar being crumbly, but a lot of commercial, like the Kraft and the Kroger's, are not crumbly.
Totally.
So maybe you need to talk a little bit about
Yeah.
commercial cheese versus
Absolutely. So
artisan cheese.
I would try as best we can as we're talking to, and that's a really good point, right? Because in America, we can say whatever we want, right? I can make champagne in my bathtub. No one's going to stop me. The EU's not into that, right? They have some really strict ideas of what champagne is, and French even more so with the AOCs. But we can do anything, right? Parmesan is in a green can often. And so when I'm talking about these, you're right, I'm totally talking about these traditional cheddars. And when you get an extra sharp cheddar, it has enough age that you see that structure. But when you get a really young cheese, you know, you're very right, you're not going to see that structure. The cheese on our plate, when we get to cheddar, you'll feel it. It's 10 months old. If you break it apart, it'll crumble. And the lights are dim, so you won't be able to see it. But if you look at that cheese compared to the other firm cheese, you'll see that it has these little curd formations and kind of textures because it just naturally faults like that. It breaks like that. Parmesan's another great example of this curd structure, and we break Parmesan down a fault line, right? Because it has that structure in it if you don't ruin it.
You're talking about Parmigiano Reggiano.
Parmigiano Reggiano, thank you. Not just Parmesan or Parmesan or any of these other words that we use to signify the non-traditional versions of these cheeses. All right, so let's move over to the Swiss Alps, another beautiful place, right? Because cheddar's not the only example of this cross-section of culture, geography, and resources. You have Osso Aratis of the Pyrenees, you have these beautiful goat cheeses of the Loire Valley, and you have the Gruyères and Comtés of the Swiss Alps and French Alps, respectively. And it's another example of using your resources to solve a problem, right? It looks beautiful like this at some point of the year, but in the height of winter, nobody's up there, right? Because it's terrible weather, and you're going to be down in the valley protecting your family, protecting your cows, and making your cheese. But you don't have so much excess grain for the cows, let alone for the family. So what are we going to feed everybody, right? I don't want to lose a cow in the winter because I don't have enough to feed it, and I don't want to take grain from the cow to feed the family. And so they come up with a giant wheel of cheese, right? Has anybody seen a Gruyere? It's an 80-pound wheel of cheese, right? And that's not just because that's the shape hoop they could find. It's because they wanted something that was large enough to deal with the inclement weather that they were going to be getting in the Swiss Alps. You wanted something, some people say that it could roll down the hill better. I don't know if that's true. You'd probably break a young wheel doing that. And then when they salt that cheese, because no one wants to carry salt up that hill, they actually make a big old vat of salt water, a brine, and each young cheese will bob in that for about a day. And that's how it absorbs the salt, as opposed to this just hand salting like you would, you know, your dinner, which is how you do it in cheddar. So very different, you know, use of your limited resources, right? Different problems to solve, therefore a different cheese comes out of it. And we talked a little bit about this village cooperative system. In many of these cultures, everybody's working towards the cheese, right? And so the person who's raising the cows is not necessarily the person making the cheese. Some cases it is, some cases it isn't. Kind of depends on how high up you are on the mountain. And then the person aging the cheese in all of these situations is totally different than the maker. In France, you have a job called an affineur. The art of affinage is the art of aging cheese, just aging cheese. Right? You have the cheesemonger who's going to sell it eventually. You have the importer, the exporter. You have all these different jobs that are just all featured around a cheese, right? You know, we talked earlier about the different things coming up. It's kind of like the auto industry in this area. You know, we sit in our shop often and somebody will come with a GM badge or a Ford badge and you start asking them which plant or which area they work at. And then everybody else in the shop who's a customer is like, oh, I work at this place. Do you know this place? Everybody's kind of, there's a lot of people working in the auto industry, and in these communities, there's a lot of people working in the cheese industry. All right, so Goudas. It's a beautiful wheel too. Beemster region. All right, so before we get a little carried away here with just going through different regions, let's talk about cheese on this kind of global movement, right? So we've talked about how it was a big influence in getting us to slow down, stop wandering, and set up societies, right? And then as it gains popularity and as we start trading cheese and the world gets a little bit, you know, we're shipping cheeses all over the world and all of a sudden somebody in the Beemster region of Amsterdam is eating a Gruyere and all of a sudden, you know, people are carrying Parmesan over the Swiss Alps and vice versa. A global market starts to form, right? It's slowly, you know, there's no FedEx, there's no, shipping's a little slower of a process and you need to make sure they're hardy wheels that are about that size that you can ship. But eventually you go from this kind of tiny experience of each village has a different cheese and each country has a different story to a globalization of cheese. And with that, you get a somewhat of a commoditization of cheese. No offense to the Dutch, but you could argue that this global commodity market really expanded quickly with the use of the Dutch, right? The Gouda is shaped perfectly to ship all around the world, right? That shape goes perfectly in a barrel. It's going to protect that cheese much better than if it was a perfect cylinder, right? It's going to protect it much better if it was an 80-pound disc, which no one has a barrel shaped like that, right? But I can all of a sudden pick a wine barrel, something that's fairly common at this time in history, and I can put 10 cheeses in it, and it has an extra layer of protection. And now that I've winded it, I'm going to lose not that much moisture comparatively, so I'm going to make more money, right? I'm not going to lose money in the winds. And so you really have all of a sudden a global commoditization of cheese. And like anything, as you have a growth market, it comes with a lot of other things, right? You get inferior products, you get people making choices that are profit driven, you get deceptive cheese making, you get bad cheese, right? Colonialism, and this has a lot of parallels. So the remarks earlier about how we see all these different cheeses with all these different names, that has a lot of historical precedent, right? So our dairy culture, which I promised I would talk about, is similar to so much of American culture. It's a product of immigrant groups coming here, right? And so the first huge immigrant group is British primarily, and they're primarily from the dairy making areas in England, right? The East Anglica area. And you also have huge groups of Swiss, Italian, German, to a lesser extent, you have French, Greek, and all of these people bring their cheese culture. And all of a sudden, America's home to Gouda's, Gruyere's, Emmentaler, Munster, all these different cheeses, right? Maybe not with the care and focus on that tradition. At some point in colonial history, we are exporting more cheddar to the UK than was being made in the UK. At this point, I don't think that's true anymore, but that was definitely true in colonial times. Let's all take a pause, and let's eat a little of American processed cheese as we kind of sync up our stories with what's happening globally with what's happening at home. So we all recognize which one the American processed cheese is. I tried to be on brand. This is not like an off-brand American cheese. This is good old Kraft. I really want you guys, whenever I whenever I try cheese, you play with your food a little bit. I know we're all told not to, but you know, there's a lot of information to pick up in cheese, and only so much of it can be picked up out of your mouth. So I encourage you to squeeze it a little bit in between your fingers before you eat it, just to get a feeling of that, and then eat the cheese. And think about milk. I remember it's supposed to be coming from milk, right? It's cheese. Think about the flavors you get, the subtleties you get, this interplay between creaminess and salt. I would challenge all of you. I think it's really hard to remember that this comes from milk. It's really salty, it's delicious, it melts perfectly, it's engineered to do so. But does it remind me of the field? Does it remind me of drinking a glass of milk? Not so much. The texture is really unique, right? It's gonna melt perfectly. But back to this like making a cheese in this like curd structure and keeping some proteins in and it doesn't seem to have a structure, right? It kind of smears. I'll tell you, the first time we ever did one of these lectures, we laid all the cheese out on little paper plates without the little wax paper, and it just glued to that paper plate. And we're like, oh my God, we needed to move it from 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and we couldn't do it. So now we have little wax papers. And it makes you question, you know, what is this item, right? And so back to the story, we have this ramping up global market of cheese, right? And we're right in the center of it in America. As it grows, there's a need for more profits, there's a need for more control, there's a need for a lot of things, right? Whenever you're trying to make profit in the world of natural goods, it's all about controlling nature. Mother Nature does not like to be controlled, and it's really the only way to make a lot of money off of an agricultural product is to have some consistency, right? And so around the industrial age, right, you start really having some breakthroughs. And some of them are technologically, you know, as we have advances in refrigeration, transportation, eventually pasteurization, you're able to all of a sudden get cheeses all over this country, right? And a lot of the things that we're still dealing with as artisan cheese makers, not that I make cheese, but in the artisan cheese making movement of raw cheese, a lot of that legislation was written then and continues to be written then, right? In the time of the jungle and different books about this kind of growing industrialization, farmstead cheeses didn't have many problems beforehand, right? If you were making a raw milk cheese on your farm, distributing amongst your friends and family or your village, people weren't really getting sick. But once you start making raw milk cheese, putting on a rail car and shipping it from Michigan to Chicago, so somebody at a cheese pooling facility in Chicago can actually make a cheese from it, and we don't have great refrigeration, or the guy 2 stops after yours has really bad milk that's tainted, and we don't have the testing processes, all of a sudden people got sick en masse, right? And so we had pasteurization, forced pasteurization in this country, and it still remains today. So currently, you can't eat a cheese or you can't sell a cheese that is raw if it's under 60 days old, right? If I age it out 60 days, we hope there's enough information in that time, enough testing, and that there's enough kind of dying off of harmful bacteria that there's no problem. But still, currently to this day, you can't have a raw milk cheese that's young. In many parts of in Europe, you can. There's a very heated debate still going on amongst regulators and cheesemakers on whether or not that's the right approach to things. But you know, in this time of growing control, in 1916, in this moment of industrialization, you get the first patent for processed cheese, right? And so processed cheese, what is that? What are we even eating, right? It actually starts with cheese. I think that's the most remarkable part. It starts with a block of cheese, Colby and cheddar, generally speaking. You shred them up, you denature them with something called sodium citrate. So all of a sudden, this bouncy block of cheese has no protein, really, it's just fluid. And then you use a little bit of emulsifiers and stabilizers, and you sheet it out, right? So our pre-sliced processed cheese has never been sliced. It just came out in a sheet, and you cut the stacks and then stack it, or cut it into squares and stack it, right? Giving it a pre-sliced kind of effect. So if we look at this cheese in the same lens that we used earlier to talk about cheddar, we've had a really big shift in cheese and identity, right? At one point, cheese is telling me all this information about my culture, my geography, and now we're taking two cheeses. We don't know where they're from necessarily. I've never seen a label of American cheese that talked about the mother cheese that goes into it. So you take these two cheeses, you strip them of their identity, you physically strip them of their properties, right? And you make them super meltable, you package them in slices, and you just distribute all over the country. And so, what does that story tell us? It tells us a story of a growing population, quickly growing, and this race towards profitability. You know, why is this cheddar even orange? Or why is this slice even orange is a great story of this kind of need for control, right? Around the 1500s, while all this is happening in many different places, this growing cheese love, right? Dairymen realized they could pull the butter out of their cream, right? At this point, butter was still happening in a super small local way, right? You had a herd, you pulled your own butter out, and then you did whatever else you did with your milk. Whether or not you pulled it with other people or some of your neighbors and you made cheese together, or if you sold fluid milk, didn't really matter. You produced your own butter and you let your friends get that butter, and that was it, right? At around the 1500s, we're all of a sudden like, hey, I can make more off of my milk than just the cheese or the fluid milk. I can do this butter thing and sell it to a wider group of people. So when you pull the fat out of milk, you change the color, right? For cow's milk, not all milks, cows carry keratin in their milk through the butter fat. So if any of you guys can think of like that perfect piece of cheese, actually this is a good example. You have this beautiful orange hue to the paste, right? We're gonna, at this case, just assume that's not colored at all, and that's just that beautiful butterfat yellow. That's what I want a swatch of painting to be called, butterfat yellow. I don't think that's a real color, but it's a real thing. And so what starts happening in the market is consumers get wise. They're like, I don't buy pale cheese. I don't want that pale stuff. It doesn't look like it's the right stuff. And whether or not that's because they're pulling the butter out or if it's just a winter wheel, right? If the cows are in the barn eating dry hay, they're not gonna have that color. The market got smart and they stopped buying those cheeses. So what do cheesemakers do? They trick us. They go ahead and put a little well, they probably started most likely with beet and carrot juice or something of that nature, but they quickly came across achiote seed or annatto seed, right? It's the same thing that we would use to color Spanish rice, so it's not actually spicy but has that beautiful red color. And so they started form color to their cheese. Doesn't matter what part of the year you're buying that cheese. Hey, I don't even now know, I don't know what season my cheese was coming from. I don't know whether or not they were eating grass. I don't know whether or not it's a full fat cheese or if you pulled some of the fat out of that cream, you know. And so as we were doing all of this race towards industrialization, many factors start changing in the cheese. So,
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
What were they doing in that photo?
They were grating the cheeses and smelling. Yeah, this is.
Smell and sight?
Yeah, I imagine, especially just based on this line of Goudas, this is one of two things. It's either a contest or it's a consortium of some nature. So many cheeses kind of go through a funneling point. Parmesan's a great example, right? If I make Parmesan, as soon as it's old enough to transport that wheel, I sell it to the consortium of Parmesan, and they sell the wheel for me, right? I sell baby cheeses. Parmesan deals with people like me or importers, right? Farmers never do. In Holland, it's very common the same way. You're not actually going to market with your fully aged Gouda. You're selling it to somebody beforehand, and they're, you know, deciding what market they're going to send it to, right? A lot of these cheeses, Gruyere, for instance, they only make Gruyere, right? And so whether or not Costco gets my Gruyere or a cheese shop like me gets their Gruyere, somebody is in the middle smelling and grating the cheese to decide that, right? There's some really talented, like wildly talented cheese graters that will have a room of 100,000 of the same wheels, and they can tell you the difference between each one. It's really remarkable stuff. I've had the privilege of judging a couple cheese contests, but not like this. I've been a judge at the Good Food Awards, and I've been a judge at that Cheesemonger Invitational that I ended up getting second place in 2014. But these guys, no cheese. Yeah, so it looks like they're grading it. And as we were talking about this identity of cheese and knowing what's in the milk, breed is something that I think you really lose, right? As soon as I'm pooling milk and pasteurizing milk from many sources, you lose those subtleties that actually do come with breed. And so the difference between Jersey milk and Holstein milk is perceivable. You can taste the difference. I mean, it takes a little practice, but it's very much so, it's a real thing. So Jerseys have the highest amount of fat content. Holsteins have the highest output, so that's why when we all think of a cow, we probably all think of a Holstein cow, because they're the milk machines of the world, right? And as we stop selecting for flavor and we start selecting for production value and efficiency, you're going to get a Holstein. You have really no reason to get something like this, an Ayrshire, which I feel like we don't even know very much in this country anymore what Ayrshires. High protein, very small fat globules, which why you would do that is if you're aging a cheese farther out, right? It needs to have tight, compact fat, small fat globules, because the large ones are going to be more perceptible towards rancidity, right? And so if I'm making one of these big Gruyères or something like that, I don't necessarily want to do it with a Holstein. I definitely don't want to do it with a Jersey. Too much fat. It's going to go funky and weird in the aging process. So, but nowadays, kind of to your earlier point, doesn't matter, right? We're not really trying to hit these notes so specifically. So we just pasteurize everything, pool it all, and you can make out of the same milk source, Gouda, cheddar, Swiss, whatever you want, all on the same farm. Which brings us to this American cheese. All right, so where's the revolution? Where are we right now? Let's all take a moment and try the second cheese, or actually, I'm sorry, let's try the goat cheese cup. So the little cup is going to be a goat cheese. All right, so those, I know it's a very polarizing cheese. If you have any allergies or anything, don't try it. But if it's just a matter of not liking goat cheese, I really encourage you to try it. Try a little bit of it. It's a good goat cheese. I think that so often, you know, Will can attest to this. We have so many people who come in and are like, oh, I don't like goat cheese. I don't want to try it. And you're like, I don't like bad goat cheese either, but try a really good one, because it's pretty exceptional, right? And you can taste milk again. Remember, we were talking about, like, when you eat the American cheese, are you struck with this idea of milk, right? You can taste that it comes from a goat. It has a taste of animal, right? It shouldn't taste like a goat in heat. If anybody grew up in a goat farm, it shouldn't be that strong. That's a pretty rough smell, and it'd be a worse taste, but it should definitely taste like a goat. You know, sheep's milk should taste like lanolin. It should taste like a sheep. Any questions? You good?
I was just comment.
Yeah.
We've switched from using cream cheese to using goat cheese on bagels and fish muffins and stuff.
And great amount of flavor, lower fat content generally speaking, higher protein content, right? It's, you know, I think that this idea of like one cheese being healthier than the others is kind of funny sometimes, everything in moderation, but goat cheese is delicious and very nutritious. I think I saw a hand up in the back. Anybody else have any questions? Please.
I was going to ask about how they make cream cheese.
So how you make cream cheese, that's a great question. You let much less of that whey drain away, right? And so you take, back to this, let's say we're at this step, you would pretty much bag that. You would let it drain a little bit more. You would put it in an actual cheesecloth bag, let it drain for another day or two, and that's it. The other big thing about cream cheese in terms of the production is, do you guys remember when I was talking about you have regular milk and you start acidifying the milk, and that's when it starts denaturing, and then you coagulate it, right? With a cream cheese, you would either do less coagulant or no coagulant at all. So you would just let it coagulate, you would let it fall apart or denature with acid, and then at a certain point in that arc, it will come back together and knit with just acid. So cheeses like mozzarella and cream cheese are examples of cheeses that usually don't have any rennet at all, or if they do, it's a very small amount. And so what that means is it doesn't tighten back up and form that same kind of strength of curd. And so you leave a little water in it and you get this great cream cheese texture. Yeah.
Question.
Please.
In our neighborhood, we buy, or they have Lebny.
Oh yeah, Labne.
Is that the same
wrong word.
as just American cream cheese?
It's more like a yogurt. It's more yogurt cultures. It's a much higher fat content than like conventional most of our yogurts. And then Labne is going to just go through less processing in general. Similar to a yogurt, you know, we just saw that picture with the little cubes of curd. It's not going to really go through that. It's going to just sit in the vat. It's going to start to sour, and then you're going to go from vat straight to a cloth or a basket. It's going to be like a farmer's cheese or a basket cheese, or more like a ricotta in its production, and never kind of keep being cut and allowed to drain and kind of create that structure. It lacks the casein structure to, you know, intentionally for it to be like that. Because, you know, if we think about where Labne comes from, right? The desert, Middle East, no refrigeration. I didn't want a cheese to last me 3 weeks, you know? I wanted to take this batch, enjoy it for dinner, maybe enjoy it for a day, 2 days, and then I'll do another batch. It's not this idea of, you know, the Gruyere where I'm like, how am I going to feed everybody 3 months from now? All the way in the back, I saw a hand go up.
They usually, I think, from the Middle East, they put in olive oil that extends the life.
Yeah, get rid of the oxygen. And we talked earlier in the lecture, those early cheeses, the fettas and the labnas and the things like this, it was about, with little resources we had, extending it, right? Cheese is all controlled spoilage, right? We have milk. Sometimes we have an abundance of milk. We know we're going to be hungry down the line. How can I extend this resource for as long as I can? So olive oil, I can keep oxygen away from it, you know, whatever I can do. So a little fast forward to now, right? Back to the revolution, right? So the American cheese revolution, unlike the American Revolution, did not start with one shot heard around the world. It instead started with a group of cheesemakers, cheesemongers, and consumers all deciding that we weren't eating good enough cheese. And it's kind of remarkable. It happened in a similar time frame, right? And so this is Jennifer. She is, actually this is both Jennifer, sorry. She's Redwood Hill Farms. They sell, even in grocery stores out here, goat yogurt. You can see their goat kefir. She started her company in 1968, if I remember correctly. And it was because her and her sisters had 4-H projects at home. At a certain point, they had too many goats to ignore the fact that they had a small herd. And they're like, what do we do? I guess we start making goat cheese, right? And at this point in history in America, there was not a lot of goat cheese production. It was definitely a European concept. And the same time Jennifer was thinking about this, Laura Chanel, who was the cheesemaker from what we just had the same idea she's going to be up in Sonoma. Jennifer's in Marin. And then around that same time, Allison Hooper all the way in Vermont for Vermont Creamery had this same idea. So really in the late 70s, early 60s, a group of female cheesemakers kind of arise, a whole new generation all at once. What's really exciting is around that same time, people that have been in existence for a long time making truly unique cheeses that were special and did reflect culture and history, all of a sudden learned how to differentiate themselves from a larger market. So with that, yeah, please, give me a chance to take a water break.
Can goat cheese be made from the little pygmy goats too?
I don't know that answer. I can tell you that goat cheese...
Small quantities.
Very small quantities. Well played. I can tell you that they can be made into a variety of things, which is, you know, once again, something that we're always kind of finding ourselves discussing at the shop. You're like, you want to try a goat cheese, and everybody expects to get the little cup I gave you, as opposed to like a firm goat cheese. But goat cheese can be just made like couch cheese into a variety of shapes, sizes, goat bries, goat goudas, super aged, goat cheeses that are going to be like a Parmesan almost. It really has a variety of applications.
So when you go into a store, you ask, I would like it to try it with the bagels. Mm-hmm. So you ask for a spreadable?
Yeah, in that case, what's your fresh goat cheese? What's your spreadable goat cheese?
Whoa. Not that big.
Yeah, they often come in these goat cheese logs. Yeah, that's usually when someone's like, I don't like goat cheese. I'm like, yeah, I don't like bad goat cheese logs either, but let's try something special, please.
Just like feta, there's sweeter ones and there's more.
Totally.
Ones. Goat cheese is also something where you might try goat cheese and it's like, that's yuck, it's too sour.
100%.
Another one is almost like a sweet cream goat cheese.
And if it's really good cheese, it should reflect the area, right? So I might not love goat cheese from farm A, but farm B, the goats are eating the right mix of clover and, I can't think of another grass right now, but either way, they're eating the right foliage to make a sweeter milk, and therefore we get to enjoy it more. And that's why it's so important not to necessarily pool this milk or flash pasteurize all this milk and kind of erase that fingerprint. And so at the same time where these wonderful women are making fresh goat cheeses, you also have cheesemakers that have been around for a really long time learning to differentiate. So the first cube, which should be towards the middle of our tray, not the white cheese that's on the edge opposite the American cheese, but there should be one in the middle.
Could we have a little light?
Yeah, we're going to need light.
I don't have that. Yeah, we got light coming up. Yes.
All right, I get.
Is it the little teeny one?
It is the teeny one, and it should just not be on the border. That's going to be the big thing. In terms of goat cheese being better or worse, goat cheese is leaner. It carries less fat, higher protein. But we get this question a lot about chocolate. Is dark chocolate better than milk chocolate? Rarely are we eating this because it's a health thing. We obviously want to take care of what we're putting. We eat it because we like it, right? It's not a supplement we're taking. It's not anything like that. And so while it could be marginally leaner or, higher in protein, I wouldn't say that it's health food, all the cheesemakers that are going to be represented in our tray, except for the American cheese, are really focused on the flavor more than anything else. So the cheese we're all chewing on right now is called Vella Dry Jack, right? It's the one towards the middle.
Swiss.
What?
Did you have a Swiss on here?
No.
Okay.
So back to all the cheeses, just to help with everybody. You had an American cheese, right? You had the cup of cheese. There should be 2 white cheeses in there, right? One cheese is going to be towards the border, right? On one side of there. There should be one of those white cheeses kind of in the middle. All right? That's Vella Dry Jack. So Vella Dry Jack. And Vella is a great example of the story I was about to jump into. What do you... If anybody needs help identifying it, why don't you just raise your hand? Will's going to come through and just point out and make sure everybody has the right cheese. The difficulty of having cheese, which all kind of looks the same. The other thing is it's going to have mostly straight sides. Back to the cheddar idea, it doesn't break as much, right? So it's going to be kind of a firmer cube. So,
And what the name of it again?
Vella Dry Jack. And so Vella Dry Jack is a cheese that totally hits all this criteria that the old cheddar hit, right? It is a reflection of a story, a geography, and the resources they had at hand. So in the 30s, and actually as early as the 20s, the Italian immigrants of Northern California started taking Monterey Jack, a cheese that was common in the area, and aging it way farther out to about 18 months, right? The reason being is we were in the middle of a world war, and twice, with Italy being one of our enemies, that meant we had embargoes on Italian-made goods. So you couldn't get Parmesan in this country. And as we all know, if you really love something and you've grown up with it, you all of a sudden say you can't have it, you're going to figure out something else to make, right? And so these immigrant families in northern Italy, which there was an abundance of them, started making dry jack. Many people made a dry jack. It became a kind of one of the first American recipes. Yes, please.
Does it melt well?
It melts all right, but kind of similar to Parmesan, where it melts better if you grate it, but if you like put a slab of this under the broiler, not going to work so well. It's dry, right? And so you really need to do a fine layer like a Parmesan, and it will melt fairly decently, but it's still going to have that kind of plasticky finish on the melt. So the Vella family, this specific creamery started in 1934 making this cheese, right? And so in 1934, they're not talking about marketing. They're not talking about making sure that they're not being kind of grouped in with all the other cheeses. But as that company progresses in the late 60s, as the son takes over, Tom from his son Ignacio, maybe the other way around, Ignacio's the son. As Ig Vella takes over from his father Tom, they move to Sonoma Square. And this is around 1969. So they're downtown Sonoma, and they start using words like artisanal or artisan cheeses, right? Handmade becomes a thing. And all of a sudden they figure out a way to get you to pay more attention to their cheese than the sliced cheeses at the store. And so while all these wonderful young cheesemakers are making their cheeses, the cheesemakers who have been making their cheeses for a really long time also learn to differentiate. And then the cheesemongers start joining in, right? In 1982, you have a really pivotal book comes out called The Cheese Primer. To this day, you get a job at a cheese counter, it's probably the first book they're going to give you or suggest. A gentleman named Stephen Jenkins wrote that, and then he opened up Fairway Market in New York. Also around 1982, you have Ari and Paul opening up Zingerman's in Ann Arbor. And then in 1983, you have the formation of the American Cheese Society, which is a like many other things, is an industrial group that allows, collaboration, education, and eventually standardization of knowledge and stuff. So the American Cheese Society started in 1983. This next iteration, what I think we're living right now of the American cheese, really is exemplified by this company. And this man right here is Matteo Keller. That actually might be his brother Andy. I can't tell in that picture. But either way, Andy and his brother Matteo, they run Jasper Hill Farms, as well as the cellar of Jasper Hills, right? And they do many different things. They don't just make cheese, but they raise 3 different herds of cow. Each herd is for a different cheese, right? Back to this idea of the herd being really specific and important, they decided about 2 years ago to start making an Alpine style cheese called Alpha Tolman. And they tried making it with the Ayrshire cows, but those Ayrshire cows weren't making the right flavors. They tried making it with the Holsteins that they had, same situation, and they actually went out and bought a herd of brown Swiss because they wanted those Alpine flavors. They wanted the characteristics that come with that milk. The other thing that they've done that's really important is that they blasted a cave into the hillside of one of their hills on the farm, right? They made the first American cheese cave. And this cave has 5 different chambers in it. Do I have a picture of the cave? Yeah, thank God. All right, 5 different chambers into the cave. And each chamber, is representative of a different type of cheese, right? You have a bloomy rinded room, so that's where you would age your Brie or a wonderful cheese they make called Harbison. You have their blue room, that's where they make a cheese called Bailey Hazen Blue. They have a washed rind room, which is the stinky room for Winnemere and Oma. And then they have the cheddar room, as well as an experimental room. And what this picture is down here is the cheddar room. I always say that this is like the cathedral of cheddar. You walk in and you got 30, 40 feet high ceilings with hundreds and hundreds of wheels of cheddar on it. This room is actually built to the specs of a cheese flipping robot. That's one of their hopes, is that they get big enough that they can invest in the same kind of technology that Europe uses, where they actually have a robot that drives down the aisle, can analyze each cheese, give it a quick brush, flip it. Because believe it or not, the hardest part of cheese making is stuff like that. You burn out your shoulder flipping out a 40-pound wheel of cheese every other day, and so they really want to eventually continue to mechanize and continue to, focus on things like cheese education, better cheese, and less flipping the cheese. I see a hand.
Actually, she was before.
Go for it, please.
So they had 3 different types of cows to get this cheese. Did they all eat the same thing?
Oh, that's a great question. I imagine they all have somewhat of the same feed. It is going to change slightly. Yeah, I think that they're probably around the same diet, because it's not so much the diet that's going to affect, it will affect the milk overall, but as long as you have a healthy cow, you're going to get those characteristics that are unique to each cow. I know that one of the things that they did in the last year is they invested in a hay dryer. So now they can feed their cows their grass year round as opposed to buying commercial hay. You know, a lot of times we're really focused on a red herring when it comes to food, right? We all want organic, we all want this, we all want that. Often organic feed for cows is shipped in from China. There's not a lot of commercially available organic feeds in the market. Getting your field certified organic is immensely costly. It is a multi-year process. You have to pay and you have no guarantee it's going to come out right. You know, if you have a neighbor who's using you know, a corn seed from a commercial catalog, there's almost no chance that you're going to get a organic certification on your field, no matter, it's not what you did to it, right? And so you all of a sudden spent half the year's income to see if you're going to get the organic certification, and you fail. I mean, it's almost not an option. So I think that they probably, just for like the needs of just operational, have a primarily the same feed, and it might get dialed in a little bit here and there as they need more fat in this recipe and less in that. And there are cheeses that now are mixed. So Bailey Hazen Blue, our #1 selling blue, and if any of you like blue cheese, run down to the store and try it, it's amazing, is a mix of their Ayrshire and Holstein. For a long time it was one and the other, and like cheese dorks like me would like look at the bottom of the label and be like, oh, it's a Holstein wheel. But now it's all mixed. But for the Alpha Tolman, it doesn't work as a mixed cheese. They need to only make it with the brown Swiss. The Harbison, I believe, is the same. The Harbison only is made with the Holstein cows, and so on and so forth.
So it's the genetics of the cow.
It's the genetics of the cow, 100%.
Where is Jasper Hill?
Jasper Hill is in Greensboro, Vermont. You can see these guys are a little bit of a bunch of hippies who own a cow farm. And this is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, hands down. Yeah, and so I always call them agrarian radicalists, because Matteo is not just making cheese, he's trying to preserve the Vermont landscape one dairy at a time. And so by building the cellars, one of the really important things they've done is they've created a pipeline for small creameries to get to market, right? And so there's so many different things that goes into from cheese to the purchase at the counter, right? We named a lot of them, right? The cheesemonger, the aging, the importing, the exporting, all these things. So Matteo has created a way where people can drop him a young cheese, give them a cheese that's not ready for market. He'll age it. He'll wrap it in this wonderful Jasper Hill branded packaging. He still gives them all the sorts of credit where it's due, but he'll market and sell your cheese. So the greatest example, I think, is the Von Trapp family. Like from The Sound of Music, they make cheese in northern Vermont. And so Oma, which means grandmother, and is them tipping their hat to the Bavarian washed rind cheeses that they grew up with or grew up listening to about, very much like a young Limburger or Munster, is aged by Jasper Hills, and also available at our shop. A really cool cheese. I always say that the hills are alive with the smell of that cheese.
That's a Von Trapp cheese?
Yeah, Von Trapp Family Creamery, aged in Jasper Hill cellars. So the verbiage gets kind of funny as you're like, Jasper Hill Cellars, or the cellar of Jasper Hills, or is it Jasper Hill Farm? Depends on which item you're talking about, as they make a lot of different products. And the last product the last product in your little fry cup or whatever is one that's made over there, right? So it's Cabot Clothbound, right? Cabot's a huge cheddar house. We see Cabot at every major grocery store, right? But like many of these huge cheddar houses, they have a lot of great access to dairy. They have a lot of great talent. And I think around 2005, 2004, as all of these artisan movements kind of increasing, Cabot Creamery was like, wait, what about us? We make cool cheese. And so Crumbly, right? I heard that, right? Because we broke the cheese earlier, so it's going to continue to break that same way. Cabot helped underwrite the formation of that cave for the right to be one of their first collaborators. So Cabot makes a cheese from one herd of their cows, right? They have hundreds of herds that they have access to, and they take one herd to make this cheese. They make it really young, and when it's still a baby cheese, they give it to Jasper Hills. Jasper Hills covers it in a thin layer of lard from their pigs that they have on the farm that they feed all the way to, so very happy pigs. They then cover it in cloth and throw it into the cave, the very landscape where the cheese is kind of coming from, right? They're eating the grass on one side of the hill, and the other side of the hill there's literally cheeses under the ground being aged. And what you get is a cheese that tastes remarkably different than a normal cheddar, and hopefully tastes of the land that it comes from. You know, their tagline is a taste of place. And so by creating a porous layer as opposed to a wax and putting it into a cave as opposed to a refrigerator, all of a sudden you get a flavor development, you get a flavor exchange. It tastes a little like limestone, tastes a little horseradishy perhaps. It should have a lot more nuance than a normal cheddar. Please.
I'm comparing it in my mind to the Cabot you can buy in the store, which they don't even put how many months it's been aged anymore, which bothers me.
Totally.
That's somewhere better than a Kraft, but this is a lot different, I think, and better than Cabot in the grocery store.
100%, and I hope so. And you know, Cabot makes a lot of different cheeses, and some of them are like totally just sandwich cheese, and some of them are center of the plate cheese, for lack of a better terminology, you know. And that getting away from the age thing is really interesting. And call me a skeptic, but I always think that when you stop talking about the age, it's because you can't keep up with it. You know, it's really hard if everybody loves your 3-year cheddar to sell enough 6-month cheddar to have enough 3-year cheddar in the cellar, right? And so what's easier to do? Call it the President's Blend. And then you don't have to hit any mark, right? You just have to hit a flavor profile. And so you see that happening a lot, even in European cheeses. The French do it the most like sophisticated. People question them the least, but you know, some of these Comté is one of my favorite cheeses. You can no longer buy a 6-month versus a year Comté. They're different profiles of Comté. And they select within all these hundreds of thousands of wheels which cheese hits that profile, right? Because back to the picture of the guys grating the Gouda, right? If you are making cheddar all day long, the size of swimming pools, right? That's what their cheese making vats look like. And you have to have the President's cheddar, the habanero cheddar, the smoked cheddar, the this cheddar, the that cheddar. You're probably not actually making many different recipes. You're making cheddar, you're grating it, and when the cheddar that you smell has, you know, really big fat globules and very short peptide chains, that means it's going to be really sharp, and you taste that at like 6 months and you're like, whoa, that is sharp. That is not going to last to be a 3-year cheddar. It's going to go bad. But it's a great extra sharp cheddar right now in the grocery store. Cryovac then, get that to the deli. And so that's what they're doing. A lot of the cheddar and the difference in recipes are what the cheese, you know, what's in the cheese, what's this inherent ability for the cheese to age gracefully. And the Cabot cloth bound, you know, it's the best herd that they have in their whole rotation. And then they're still tasting it and making sure that it's going to make it to that mark. And they always say, you know, back to the keeping up demand, when I first started with Cabot cloth bound at Zingerman's in 2005, it was always a year old. Now, it's always 10 months old. I'm really hoping it doesn't get any younger. But, you know, Zingerman's, for instance, they age their own Cabot cloth bound. They get whatever wheel they get, and Sean will hold it for 6 months to a year before he puts it on the counter, because he really likes that older profile. And if they can't do it, well, Sean can. We at Provisions don't have that kind of space yet, but so you can get a 10-month-old cheddar, and it's delicious. I mean, you just actually had it.
One of the problems I find is I buy an extra sharp cheddar from one company and an extra sharp cheddar from another company, and one's really nice, sharp bite to it and crumbly, and the other one is like, damn, this feels young.
I mean, so much of the language around cheese isn't controlled, right? Extra sharp doesn't mean the same thing to one person or another, and there's no like grading system to make sure that it works. And so, you know, I always find that a logical conclusion of a talk like this is like, well, what do I do as a consumer, right? And what I would tell you is find a cheesemonger. And I know that sounds silly, but if you go to a grocery store and it's just aisles of cheese and no one to answer any questions, maybe consider buying your cheese somewhere else where there is someone who's standing behind the counter, who's passionate, who can answer some of these questions. And most importantly, beyond the answering the questions, get you a taste of the cheese. Stop buying cheese that you've never tried before. It's suffocating in a cryovac package that came from God knows where. I mean, for so long, even those cheeses that have these great names feel so disconnected from a place, from a story, from a person who makes them. And we really focus both with how we source cheese and how we talk about it on cheese that connects you to those things again. We wanted to tell you more about a people and a culture than it does about a company. I would say, without a shameless plug, look for people who've been certified cheese professionals by the American Cheese Society. One of the things that group tried to do was standardize the knowledge that we all have. Similar to wine and sommeliers or beers and Cicerone, they created a test 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, that whether you're a cheesemaker, a cheesemonger, a cheese importer, everybody can take this test. It's a 300-question test, and we're all just making sure we're all speaking the same language, that we all know what the difference between, a cheddar and a Gouda is beyond just the flavor, but in the recipe. I saw a hand go up.
Yes. What is a cheesemonger?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. It was actually supposed to be in the first paragraph of this speech I just ran off on. Yeah. No, totally. So cheesemonger, right? It's a silly sounding name. It's a job title. It means more than just someone who eats cheese all day, although I definitely don't let that slow me down from my half pound a day. A cheesemonger is actually a craft that goes back to the 1500s. In kind of the first really explosion of the cheese market in the UK, the Cheesemongers Union became a thing in the 1500s, and it was a group of tastemakers designed to do exactly what we still do and tell you which stuff was good enough to buy. So there was a region, East Anglica, that was known for the best dairy in England, and best butter, best cheese, everything was going really well from that area. And as the industry grew, all of a sudden everybody's cheese was selling, not just the really good stuff. And the cheesemongers came out of that, and it's still a tradition today. And I always say that beyond just this idea of giving our stamp of approval, cheese making is a very difficult job. And I think the cheesemakers, without making fun of them too much, are like the engineers of the food world. They're really good at what they do. They do that, and they don't necessarily vary from that, right? Those cows always need to be milked 7 days a week. There's no such thing as a Christmas vacation for a cow, and you can't leave the farm, let alone leave the farm to then go be gregarious at a cheese counter and tell people about trying their stuff. They want to be with their animals. They want to be in their cheese making vats. They don't want to be selling their product. And so we came out of that. Cheesemongers, my highest goal and my highest hopes is that I'm telling the stories for these people and making those cheeses come alive and connecting you to these people so they can still be making their cheese, because if they had to come down to the market, we wouldn't have cheese to eat. And so I hope that a cheesemonger is that bridge between consumer and cheesemaker and kind of your guide, through these tastes. 2 questions. Yeah, right in the back first. Yeah.
When you were talking about Monterey Jack,
Mm-hmm.
becoming dry Jack, does that eventually become like a Parmigiano Reggiano or anything like that?
It was that was the idea. Is the reason why they let it come to a dry Jack is that it would be a Parmesan substitute and allow them to grate it on their pasta. A little thing I didn't say, and at the end of the talk we have a little table set up where you can see some of these goods. The dry Jack ends up being a fun little mascot for our company, because as a way to make a rind that would age 18 months, they actually they make a mixture of a little bit of oil, pimentone, and cocoa powder, and they paint that cocoa powder on the outside of the cheese. So Will and I, our shop, we talk a lot about cheese, but we also talk a lot about chocolate, and that should be the last little bite in your cup. There should be a little piece of chocolate. And back to this idea of connection of geography and food, we only sell chocolate made by chocolate makers, right? So many of us, and most of the time we talk about chocolate, we talk about chocolatiers. And so chocolatiers like Gale's Chocolates, like Bon Bon Bon, like Chocolat, they all buy bars or wafers from other people, couverture, and they melt it down, they add some flavors, and they make it their own. It's still an art form. It's still a very dedicated craft, but it's just not what we're focusing on. Chocolate makers, they buy beans from all over the world, and they make chocolate from it. And so what you have right now, or what you're hopefully enjoying, is a Madagascar chocolate from Fresh Coast. Fresh Coast is in Traverse City, an amazing chocolate maker in Michigan. And we like to say we carry them not because they're from Michigan, but because they make fantastic chocolate.
Is that about 80 to 83%?
That's a 70%.
70.
And it should be really bright, right? Kind of get you in the corners of the mouth. And that's Madagascar chocolate. If you come to our shop, we have probably 5 chocolate bars from Madagascar. Regardless of the percentage, you're going to get those same kind of notes, right? It talks about terroir. And that's what we're trying to do with food. We want to talk about geography and that connection. So I won't pretend to be able to go into it like Will can on chocolate. It's a whole other lecture I hope you invite us back for. Will does a fabulous job, and he can talk about the difference between chocolate from Belize versus chocolate from, Vietnam. And we have a lot of different fun. We have a lot of fun with those tastings. And you can come into the store and kind of take a tour through the chocolate producing world. And you can take a tour through all the cheese producing world and, kind of taste some of the things that I've been talking about. And hopefully you can taste the difference. We really, to steal Zingerman's tagline there, a lot of people come up and they're, I don't know anything about cheese. If you know what you like, you know enough, right? There's no test, there's no pop quiz. It's about enjoying it. And hopefully, similar to the enjoyment we've kind of grown with, farmers markets and sourdough bread and heirloom tomatoes. It's about taking your level of enjoyment to one step farther and being connected to something. So that's what we're hoping for. Please.
What's the optimum way to prepare the cheese, like pull it out?
Oh, yeah.
And the best way to store it in your fridge?
Great question. Thank you. Room temperature. Always serve cheese at room temperature. It's my biggest challenge at the counter is I'm always handing you cheese out of a refrigerator, which is great because it means I'm keeping my cheese in a good way and I'm making sure everybody's safe and everything like that. But you'll see me every once in a while like warm up a cheese between my hands with a little deli paper, because the warmer the cheese, the more flavors you get. And the hardest part is the flip side of that is the colder the cheese, often the more defects you taste, because you don't have some of the warm and like delicious cream coming out. So you'll just taste what's wrong with the cheese when it's cold. So always at room temperature. I would say cutting, don't worry about it so much. People like freak out when they see a hunk of cheese and they're like, how do I cut it? Rind to paste ratio matters to a certain point, but like that's for me to worry about, not consumers. Just eat the cheese and enjoy it. In terms of storage, yes, Will.
Can you define paste?
Thank you. Paste is the center. Rind being everything on the outside. Paste is the cheese at yeah. So when I talk about that rind to paste ratio, it's about not leaving the last person with just a big hunk of rind and no cheese on there. And with soft cheeses, often you can eat the rind, right? That whole question, do I eat the rind? Soft cheeses, 99% of the time it's an edible rind. Soft cheese is another word for that category, of surface ripening cheeses. The surface is doing something to the cheese. That means it's alive, that means it's healthy, that means it's safe. If it was plastic, or if it's paraffin, or if it's anything else, it's not surface ripening because it's a sterile environment. It's not alive, right? And so don't eat that rind. That's going to hurt your teeth. But like a brie, even if it looks a little weird, it's all delicious. And if I'm introducing myself to a new cheese and I don't know if I'm going to love it, I eat it paste first towards the rind. As you get further towards the rind, you'll get more flavor. If I don't like what's going on, I'm certainly not going to like the rind. If I do like what's going on, take it all the way to the maximum amount of flavor and eat the rind. And in terms of storage, just so I don't forget that question, your crisper drawer is actually a cheese drawer. Just no one told you yet. It's the best place for your cheese. Never on the top shelf, because that's where the most air movement happens. It'll dry out your cheese the fastest. Try to stick away from Tupperware, Saran wrap, and Ziploc bags, because your cheese needs to breathe a little bit, right? I sell cheese paper. Most places like Plum now sells cheese paper. Formaticum's the most common company, and it's 2-ply. It's like a thicker gauge paper and then a little plastic wrap. And the idea is that you create an environment where ammonia can kind of expel from the cheese, but oxygen isn't going to get in and dry it. So that's my cheese storage, all the way at the back.
I just have a question about, that layer of ash that comes through cheeses.
Yeah.
Like,
where's it come from? Is it really truly edible? Is it a
Yeah.
natural thing, or is it like something like you know, like it's like it looks like dirt or something?
Totally. It is ash. You can buy 5-pound bags or 20-pound bags of vegetable ash in cheese making catalogs. And the reason why is ash is probably our second rind in history. I think the first rind was most likely leaves. Fig leaves specifically make a great little cheese rind. Fig sap also helps as a coagulant, so it was most likely leaves. But a close second was in this need to sterilize something and not having an understanding of microbiology. If you burn something, it's clean, right? It's a way of sterilizing something. So if I have a cheese, the ash really starts with the cheese called Morbier, right? So Morbier is a byproduct of a cheese called Comté, an 80-pound wheel, right? So if I make this 80-pound wheel and I got a little bit of milk left, but not enough for a whole cheese, from the morning milking, I lay down a layer of cheese, right? Because it's not enough for the whole cheese. And then I want to make sure that the flies don't get to it and it's somewhat sanitary until I get there for the evening. So I cover it with ash, come back in the evening, pour my next layer down, and that's Morbier. And it has this ash rind all the way through. Humboldt Fog is just mimicking Morbier aesthetically. No one's making Humboldt Fog in 2 steps, but it's beautiful. There's a whole tradition of cheeses in the Loire that are covered in ash, and they're smaller formats. Some are a log, some are a little donut cheese, there's some that are pyramids, and that rind to paste ratio makes vastly different cheeses. We've now found, whatever amount of 1,000 years later, that ash also neutralizes the pH in goat's milk, making it go from like really high acidic experience to that more like lemon curd and tasty flavors. Yeah, looks like you have a follow-up? Yeah.
Like, what is the ash actually from?
Usually grapevines. You know, in terms of like the agricultural world, it takes a tremendous amount of pruning and burning of vines to get ready from one season to the next. And, you know, I lived in Napa, so I didn't know that until I was staring out on the cliff and was like, it looks like there's 8 fires right now on the other side of that valley. And you're like, oh, if it's not in the news, it seems like this is a thing that happens this time of year. So everybody's burning all their vines down and then collecting the ash. It is totally safe to eat an ash ripened cheese. That's another example of, it's not in this case alive, but if it's an ash ripened cheese, it is totally safe to eat and most likely going to contribute to the flavor.
Do you know what percentage of cheese sold in this country is domestic versus imported?
No clue. I'm not going to pretend to know. I can definitely say that the artisan cheese movement is growing, and domestic cheese is getting more and more attention. I know this wasn't the question, but I'm going to just use this as a jumping off point about price. We often are really frustrated when we go to the counter and someone's like, here's an amazing American cheese and it's 2 times more expensive than any of the European cheeses you know the name of, right? And you're like, Gruyere, Roquefort, these are such special cheeses. Why are they less expensive? Well, because we give corn subsidies, not milk subsidies, and there isn't infrastructure in this country to grow cheese. So back to like the idea of selling it to a consortium or having some type of like AOC or DOP or some kind of government agency helping you with your cheese. We just don't have that yet. And so you really have these young cheesemakers doing everything and trying to create the whole world. And so they can't sell their cheese at that price. Pecorino Toscano, great cheese, right? Sheep's milk from Tuscany. Sheep's milk is incredibly expensive. Sheep make a lot less milk than a cow. I can sell Pecorino Toscano for $19 on the counter. There is not a domestic sheep's milk cheese that I've come across that can hit that price point. And it's just the reality of how much work and how much infrastructure that the Italian government has done, and the consortium of Toscano and all these other groups to make that cheese get to market. Yeah. Actually, all the way in the back.
Can you freeze cheese?
Yeah, yes and no. It's a great question. I would say what's a much better practice and something that we're not going to do is freezing curd is better than freezing cheese. Young cheeses like cream cheese and things like that, not such a big deal. Firmer cheeses, they're not going to come out of a frost so well. You're going to change textures and things like that. I mean, I think in a pinch, sure, I would encourage you to buy less cheese and like visit me more often, please. You know, But I've definitely heard of cheesemakers who will freeze their curd between seasons. You know, sheep and goat don't do a year-long lactation cycle. They take a time off. So if any of you guys have friends who have goat farms or anything like that, it's coming into their busy season, right? And about lambing season's already started. Goats in about a couple weeks. And all of a sudden, all at once, they start giving birth. And then about a month later, after you let the young ones get healthy enough, you can start taking a little milk away from the mom. You can start making goat cheese and sheep's milk cheese again. Goats you can trick by changing the lights and changing the heat in the barn. You can pretend that it's summer or spring and they'll start, you know, mating again. Sheep won't budge. So if you want to make sheep cheese year round, you're freezing your curd. I mean, if you're getting sheep cheese this time of year from a small producer, you can actually guarantee that that's what they're doing because there's no physical way for them to have fresh milk right now.